Hello, everybody, and welcome to 16th episode of Emotional Intelligence, your greatest asset and key to success. Today, our topic is grief. There's a lot of grieving going on around Mother's Day and Father's Day, and in general, there's a lot of grieving going on for the life that we wish we had, or the life we didn't have, or things that we've lost. It doesn't matter if it's a pet, a parent, a friend, or a way of life. So today I have brought on a guest. Her name is Jen Berger. She is a PQ coach. And so, hello, Jen. Thanks for
Hi.
being here.
Hi, Jamie. Thanks for having me.
Yes, it's wonderful. And Jen and I met on the PQ app. And when I was reaching out for podcast guests, she answered right away and we connected and clicked. So it's so wonderful to have a new friend. And just let me just read a little bit about Jen so our viewers and listeners can learn about her. So she is a PQ coach and she specializes in burnout and mental fitness. Her coaching journey began 10 years ago after recovering from trauma and addiction. She spent 7 years coaching at a residential trauma and substance recovery center where she lived on site to continue helping clients after hours. This inspired her research into burnout, which gave birth to her current program, From Burnout to Brilliance. And in 2021, she founded Silver Wheel Coaching LLC, and she joined the Positive Intelligence community, which amplified the impact of her burnout coaching. So she works with burnt out, exhausted women who are ready to face life's challenges with grace and ease. And as someone who has run several small companies, Jen has a special passion for working with small business owners, their burnout, and other people, employees and their burnt out situation. And also on their bottom line as their healing resuscitates their business. And she works with businesses again to support employees who are experiencing burnout. And if you've done any social media or watched any TV or read the news, you know that burnout has become a really huge problem. And this is Mental Illness Awareness Month. So it's especially important to talk about some of these difficulties because when you're burnt out, you're not functioning at the highest level you can. And there was a phenomenon called quiet quitting, and I think part of that was about burnout. So Jen is from Colorado. As a child, she split her time between Maryland and Colorado, so she has a passion for both oceans and mountains. Her current roommates are two kitty cats, whom you will see if you have a session with her. They are part of the whole healing process for her because animals and nature provide a lot of grounding for healing, and I think that is so wonderful. And she's also in the process of using permaculture techniques to rehabilitate a field that was nothing but weeds for 6 decades. And she's changing it into a foraging field filled with Colorado native plants to support the local wildlife. So, Jen, as all my guests are, you are a multi talented person. And thank you for being here.
Absolutely. And thank you for the introduction. And yeah,
Yeah, so it was interesting. I trained as a spiritual director, and one of our units was on grief. And we met for 2 years every week for 3 hours. And so we had to cover a lot of territory, and we didn't really get to touch on grief a lot. But I've also done a lot of trauma work where we touched a lot on grief. So I'm really familiar with it. And in April is the anniversary of 5 different people who were close to me who
mm,
died in various years, including my brother and sister-in-law, stepsister, and closest friend. So it was a tough month. But one thing I learned about the people who presented on grief lost a daughter,
mm,
and they got that dreaded phone call late at night, the dreaded knock on the door. And when you get the dreaded knock on the door, you don't even need to know what they're going to tell you. You just know it's not going to be good.
Yeah.
because nobody knocks on your door in a uniform with a badge in the middle of the night. And so that grieving process started 20 years ago. And they decided that they couldn't just live in the grief, that they had to be able to do something with it. So they decided to help other people understand grief.
Nice.
And yeah, right. And so, based on what I said at the beginning, what are your thoughts about the way that we are grieving now and some of the current situations around grief?
Um, I think for one, grief is a massive subject, so we're not going to be able to touch on everything. One of my thoughts, if we're talking about grief just related to death, I think our culture has gotten kind of off base because starting back in like the 40s or so,
Mm-hmm.
life and death became this thing that happened behind hospital doors.
Mm-hmm.
And so death became this very scary thing over the years. And we began using a lot of euphemisms. Like
Mm-hmm.
people talk about, I lost my mom.
Mm-hmm.
Did you leave her in a park somewhere? Or, I had to let my pet go.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of actually using the words like, this last fall, both of my pets entered their final stages of life at the same time. And I had to make the choice to euthanize both of them
Mm-hmm.
within 7 weeks of each other, which was brutal.
Yeah.
But actually using those terms of, I chose to euthanize them, they died, I
Mm-hmm.
think is very important for us to say these words instead of euphemisms because it connects us with the reality that
Mm-hmm.
is.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's one of our issues is we've really begun to fear death. We've begun to not necessarily fear death, but there's like such a mystery around it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think that's one thing that's really nice is we are returning to a lot more people having hospice care at home
Mm-hmm.
and returning it to a home-based system. Um, but with grieving, I think the other thing we've forgotten is grieving and mourning in particular, is really a time of transition.
Mm-hmm.
We're not meant to be stuck there.
Yeah.
And mourning is really about this transition from having a physical relationship with someone to a spiritual relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And, it sounds like you very much know that that is a painful process. And there are still days that, just a few days ago, I was working on things and I was like, I know my mom's with me all the time,
Mm-hmm.
but I really wish she was here right now to answer this question.
Mm-hmm.
And that was 11 years ago that she died. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. For some reason, I have some kind of an intuitive spiritual ability to communicate with dead people,
mhm,
people in my past who have been very important to me. And I like to tell this story because it's really profound. One of my spiritual mentors when I was in college, I went to Gonzaga University and I was a practicing Catholic. And at one point, I wanted to be a priest, and of course, Catholic Church says no. But then I thought, well, my friend Laura was a nun, and I thought, well, maybe I'll be a nun. And I thought, I really don't want to be a nun, but I wanted to be a priest. And so Laura and I had a little joke, and she called me Monsignorina. And she died a few years back, and it just broke my heart because I loved her so much. And she knew how much I wanted to serve the church. And one night during spiritual direction class, actually, she appeared twice. Excuse me. One night she appeared sitting next to me and she was just smiling. She was just happy because she knew that I was right where I needed to be. And then another night, I was not paying attention. It was on Zoom. And as sometimes we do on Zoom, we start multitasking. And she came in and said, "Stop, stop it and pay attention. And I said, okay. And then when my brother died, he just decided to check out. He had been dying for years, and it took a long time, and it was a slow, horrible death. And so I kept saying, Jerry, are you okay? And I finally said, are you with mom? Because my mom died when I was a baby. I
Mm,
said, are you with mom? And I got the dream that night. I got the dream. He was with my mom. He was okay. He was reunited. He took her death really hard, and he never got to process it because, you talk about the 40s. Well, it took a long time for our society to have therapy
right.
and be okay with therapy and do grief therapy or trauma therapy or whatever kind of therapy. And so my brother really didn't get to grieve properly. Either did my other brother or sister. They never had those resources.
Right. And I think that's such an important thing that we are moving towards
Mm-hmm.
is allowing that space to breathe. And
Mm-hmm.
touching on the stories you shared, a lot of people are quick to dismiss dreams or intuitions or feelings. And again, that's, denying this connection we still have
Mm-hmm.
to, this thing that's greater than us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but with having that space to grieve, we're starting to talk a lot more about therapy
Mm-hmm.
and, and then of course post traumatic growth and things like
Mm-hmm.
this. But a lot of times we're not allowing ourselves the time we truly need. Like we have these like platitudes and we say these things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but we expect others or ourselves
Mm-hmm.
to, just get back to regular life much more quickly than I think is reasonable. And that's another big thing that I think is important for people to know is, we talked about grieving looks different for everyone.
Absolutely.
And there are some people who, you know, go back to work right away, go back into their routines right away.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not always a sign that they're not dealing with it. This is how they're dealing with it.
Exactly.
And I think that's important to validate that we all have a different experience. We all have a different way of going through grief.
Mm-hmm.
And this applies to grief around death, but
Mm-hmm.
also, as you mentioned in the beginning, like any kind of change that happens in our life. When we're, if you're getting married, there's also this grieving period. Like you're really excited about getting married, but there's a grieving period about the loss of a single life.
Yeah.
If you've been trying to have a child for a lot of years and you finally get pregnant,
Mm-hmm.
I've known several women who, about 6 months in, they found themselves completely emotional and they're like, what's wrong? Why am I so sad? Well,
Mm-hmm.
you're giving up your nights of sleep. Everything in your life is about to change. And so even positive changes can have
Mm-hmm.
grief.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So I want to just stop you for a
uh-huh,
second because I want to talk about transitions.
yeah,
And I've mentioned this book many times on this podcast because it was so powerful. It's called Transitions by William Bridges. It's in a 25th edition, which tells you how important this book has been to people. But it starts with an ending and then a
exactly.
middle and then a beginning. So if you're kind of stuck, like you said, stuck grief, you're
Mhm.
stuck in that place and you can't move forward. It's almost like you've got your feet tied into cement, and that becomes a real problem because you said grief is individual and grief is so complex. It isn't like there's one way to grieve. There aren't, stage one, stage two, stage three, stage four, stage five, as has been written about and researched. People are now discovering that it's kind of like a cow path. It kind of goes this way and that way, and so you may be in stage one of denial, but then you can maybe go to acceptance and back to denial and back to this and over to that. And, it comes in waves.
And it does. And yeah, because it's not a linear path. It's
Mm-hmm.
this thing that, again, unique for everyone. You
Mm-hmm.
don't have to I think there's more and more realization that the traditional topics of, the 5 stages of grief, maybe
Mm-hmm.
not so valid for everyone.
Right.
Because you're not going to go through all these different pieces. Like my grief is going to look different than yours, and
Mm-hmm.
that's the beauty of life is we're all
Mm-hmm.
different.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
but yeah, and it comes in waves, and it can hit you at the funniest time.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a story: is last year for Fourth of July. Again, because I was raised between Maryland and Colorado. When
Mm-hmm.
I was in Maryland for Fourth of July, we'd go down to the bay and watch the fireworks go off over the bay.
Mm-hmm.
And other times we'd stay home and we'd watch on TV the Capitol fireworks,
Oh, yeah.
because we were right outside DC. And so last year I had helped organize a block party for Fourth of July, and I come in and I sit down and I'm watching the Capitol fireworks because they're broadcast nationwide now. And it was just
Mm-hmm.
mom's birthday is July 5th. And
Oh.
so Fourth of July is when we would, celebrate.
Mm-hmm.
And so I sat down and just as a tribute to her, I'm watching the Capitol fireworks and they have the show and all the music and they were doing a tribute to wounded veterans.
Mm.
And this opera singer comes on and she has this beautiful voice and she starts singing mom's favorite song from The Sound of Music,
Oh, gosh.
which was Climb Every Mountain.
Oh, yeah.
And I remembered quickly how badly it burns when you have sunscreen running into your eyes
Oh,
because it was just waterworks, and I was like,
yeah.
out of nowhere. And it
Yeah.
was for me, and this is, I know we were going to bring in a little bit of positive intelligence. And to
Mm-hmm.
me, this was sage grief because, like,
Mm-hmm.
yes, there was waterworks, but it wasn't necessarily a sorrow. Like, it was part
Mm-hmm.
sorrow,
Mm-hmm.
but it was also, thank you, mom. I really needed to feel you today.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm so glad, like, because of all the random songs, that's not a
Mm-hmm.
song you would think of for a 4th of July
Mm-hmm.
celebration.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, so it can come at any time, 10 years
Right.
later.
Yep. Oh, yeah. It's interesting. When my mother died on January 15th, 1965, and every year without fail, that day I feel depressed. And it didn't dawn on me for a very long time why out of the blue am I depressed today? And so my body knew,
Mhm.
even though I was a baby. But I want to touch on a couple of things that reminded me when you were talking about that. One is that people don't know how to talk to other people
Yes.
about grieving, and they're afraid to say something. And I think people want to talk about it. I think they want to say, they just want to be heard. They don't need to be fixed. They don't need advice.
Uh-huh.
My friend Susie from high school, I met her for coffee when I was back in my hometown, Spokane, and her son died of an overdose.
Mm.
And nobody wanted to mention it to her. And so we talked about it, and I said, "Is it okay?" And she said, "Yes, nobody wants to talk about it." And so I was grateful that she was able to share with me and talk about the grief that she had been experiencing. And as far as I'm concerned, you just never get over some griefs are just too hard to bear, and one of them is losing a child.
And I have several friends who have lost, children in childhood as well as
Mm-hmm.
adulthood.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that is one thing because you're always a parent. And
Yeah. Right.
that is one of the ones that's very brutal. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes that's where I've seen people really come up with, truly amazing foundations or programs like you were
Mm-hmm.
talking about earlier, is
Mm-hmm.
doing something good with it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and for your friend, I think that goes back into some of what I was talking about with death and everything becoming
Mm-hmm.
taboo.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also some deaths that are considered very taboo, like if it's an overdose or if
Yeah.
it's, suicide or
Yeah.
anything like that, that becomes taboo in some people's minds. And one thing I've found working with clients
Mm-hmm.
is what they tend to love to do is, let me talk about who this person was.
Yes.
Because, and even
Mm-hmm.
in, like when my mom died, it was, similar to your brother, where it was long drawn out, it was not
Mm-hmm.
pretty. and everyone wanted to talk about that. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
let me tell you about the woman she was.
Yeah,
Let
right.
me tell you this light that the world has lost
Mm-hmm.
and just how amazing she was. And I think that's especially important for people, especially parents who have lost kids, but
Mm-hmm.
anyone
Mm-hmm.
who's is, even if the person was 100 years old, talk
Mm-hmm.
about like the brilliance they brought to this world because we all bring our unique brilliance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I think that kind of helps us move through
Mm-hmm.
because when you talked earlier about being stuck in grief, I think that's because when mom died,
Mm-hmm.
like my addiction, my eating disorder just went off the rails.
Mm-hmm.
Luckily, I got help shortly after, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm obviously in a very different place now. Um, but I got stuck in it because I
Yeah.
was so focused on what I didn't have, what I
Right.
lost, and the
Yeah.
pain.
Yeah.
But there was also, and here's just a little side note, because I had helped take, because I had kind of white knuckled sobriety when mom was
Mm-hmm.
sick.
Mm-hmm.
And I was, taking care of her, and I had like all her medications memorized, everything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was also this guilt that a
Oh.
lot of people are afraid to talk about
Mm-hmm.
of so many caretakers I know after the person they're taking care of dies,
Mm-hmm.
there's this relief because
Right.
not only is that person not suffering,
Mm-hmm.
but I get my life back. And
Mm-hmm.
that's another thing that people are just embarrassed to talk about is the relief that they feel, not just for the other being, whether that's a person or an animal, whatever, but the relief they feel for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that
Wow.
can keep us
Yeah.
still.
I am so glad you brought that up because I experienced that very much when my dad died and my brother. Part of it was you're suffering and I don't want to watch you suffer. And part of it was, okay, I don't have to make that overnight trip or I don't have to get on a plane in an hour. And it so yeah, I felt ashamed. I'm like, "Oh my gosh, this sounds terrible." But part of it was, but he's in the hospital and he had a stroke and he woke up blind in one eye and my brother couldn't eat. And so all of these things kind of ball up together like a ball of yarn and it takes a while to unravel that. But every feeling is valid.
And
Every feeling is valid.
everything feeling is valid. And also when you've been, especially if you've been caretaking in any
Mhm.
sense, is you might feel guilty about the relief for yourself, but then you
Mhm.
also have this complete loss of routine.
Yeah, right. No structure.
There's suddenly like this was my day was I got up at
Mhm.
this time, I did this, I got made sure meds were done by this time. We did, it was so
Mhm.
structured. And then you're like, now what do I do?
Mhm.
And I think it's, you know, again, touching on, we talk a lot in our culture about like, yes, therapy is important and, working through
Mhm.
this is important, but we don't talk about all these different pieces that are the reality of
Mhm.
grief.
Mhm.
And when we're feeling ashamed and we have this loss of structure and we're feeling lost and we're feeling all these things,
Mhm.
it's easy to get stuck in grief.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
easy.
Yeah. It makes me think too, and going back to not talking about it or not allowing other people to process it. I had a couple of miscarriages
Hmm.
and they were very, very painful. And I was at work and the people around me knew and they told me to be quiet. They wouldn't talk about it. They wouldn't let me talk about it. And this one person had a baby shower and she didn't want to invite me. And
And
that hurt because it's just because you're having a baby doesn't diminish, my experience.
yeah. And that is, yeah, that's another very, unfortunately, a lot of people still find that to be a taboo subject too. Like we have so many taboos for a
I
culture that considers
know.
itself so open, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, and I think there is a growing movement of women speaking out about miscarriages and things like that because it is grief.
It's a
It is.
huge grief and
And the other
maybe it's Yeah. And some people have had miscarriages and then carried a baby to term,
Yeah.
and other people like me, I adopted.
Hmm.
And I'm grateful because God sort of said, your gene pool may not be good, but
Well,
this other
actually,
boy is going to brighten your life.
and
So,
as we were talking about that, I realized that I left out a bit, half our population because we also,
yes.
when there's a miscarriage,
Hmm.
the fathers are grieving too, but we
Exactly.
really don't let men have their feelings.
Right. I was going to mention that men have a different way of grieving and it is culturally constructed,
Yeah.
right? There's like a script almost. Like this is, you're a guy, didn't affect you, whatever, on any level. Like my dad, he didn't know how to grieve when my mother died.
No.
He had no idea. He didn't have tools. He had 4 kids
Yeah.
and
And,
a job. Yeah.
and is suddenly a single dad.
Right. A
And
single dad trying to make a living, trying to support 4 kids, a baby and three, a preteen and 2 teenagers, and he didn't know what to do.
yeah.
And nobody said, "Wow, John, that must have been really tough.
And
I'm
I'm
sorry
also
you had to go
guessing
through
no
that."
and I'm also not guessing no one said, "Wow, you did a great job."
No, no. He did what he could. He did the best that he could with what he had, with the tools that he had. He didn't have an easy childhood. He didn't have the kind of role models, that sometimes I think we have a lot to be grateful for, in that we do have a mental health awareness month. We have, therapy has become pretty commonplace, and people are talking about it and talking about processing and trauma,
Mhm.
like what we started talking about. There's all this stuff is in our lexicon now.
And it's starting to become part of our lexicon. And I think, where we need to move with it is
Mm-hmm.
to, shine a light on a lot of these things, especially grief.
Mm-hmm.
Is, when I was working with clients with trauma,
Mm-hmm.
or even addiction, because guess where addiction stems from?
Oh, for sure. Sometimes, yes.
And so, I'm like, okay, like we have to shine a light on the monsters in the closet,
Mm-hmm.
because once you have a light on them, you can see how big and scary they are or how not scary they are, but you can at least see them.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we need to continue, like pulling this curtain back on grief
Yes.
around death. But
Mm-hmm.
also, we really need to start validating that grief is, everywhere. It's a part of life.
Yeah.
Every new beginning is an ending,
Right.
and or comes from an ending,
Yes.
and you know actually honor that too. We
Mm-hmm.
really, a lot of times, people, like after a breakup,
Mm-hmm.
people are like, okay, well, time to move on or get over it, or you should,
Right.
right?
Right.
And that's grieving, that's
Mm-hmm.
mourning.
Yes.
And so shining a light on this and really saying, okay, so this is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's a time of transition.
Mm-hmm.
That's all it is a time of transition. And then understanding that and going, okay, so here's some skills to start
Mm-hmm.
moving through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there are a lot of wonderful books out there that are really helpful. Memoirs and I remember reading a couple of them myself when my brother was dying, and when I was doing my training as a hospital chaplain, where every day grief, every single day, and it was I was glad to be present for it,
Hmm.
and I was present for it. The medical staff couldn't be present for it,
Right.
but they couldn't. They had to administer medication and take blood pressure and do this and do that. But the chaplain could stay in the room and say, "Yeah, tell me about that. Do you want to talk about that?" And working with families. But we're out of time,
Oh, my.
and I know it went by fast. And as you said at the beginning, we are barely scratching the surface on this subject, and we would love to hear from you. This video will be posted on my YouTube channel, and Jen will have access to it, and she will spread it however she does. And if you want to say stuff in the comments about it, just know that if we didn't cover it, it's not because we didn't think it was important. It's just that this is a short podcast and we just wanted to bring it up and say, yeah, it's a thing, it's real. And if you're grieving, you're not alone. We
You're
love
not.
you.
And can I say one more quick thing?
Yeah.
So one of my biggest things that I work with, and I'm still working with it myself, is really, and this is a positive intelligence concept of when you find yourself grieving, when you find yourself in sorrow, notice your thoughts. If you're
Yes.
going, this is awful, this happened to me, you're grieving from a saboteur side.
Yeah.
And it's time to do your best. And this takes time. It's not immediate. This isn't a condemnation, but do your best to start to shift those thoughts into how lucky am I to have had you in my life? I am so grateful that you were part of my life for however long or short a time.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's, calling on the sage powers, the empathy power is huge here because
Hmm.
sometimes it's not giving it's giving empathy to others, but it's really giving it to ourselves. Like, yeah, you're right to feel that way. It's okay. I'm gonna hug you.
Hmm.
Or even the navigate power, which I really like. How would my old self tell my younger self? What would you say? Imagine your 80-year-old self telling your 50-year-old self something. I wish I had, or, you know, so I think it is great. I'm glad you brought that up. And so if you want to find out how PQ can transform your life in so many ways,
Hmm.
then our information is in the show notes. I would be happy to jump on a call with anyone and find out just how much power positive intelligence has. I know it has changed my life tremendously.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And now I want to play a song for you all. So just one moment while I share my screen. And here it is. Share and John Upton. Right.
Grieving is part of the journey. Saying goodbye to who I thought I was. Life is a mystery, full of twists and turns. One little lesson that I've learned: forgiveness.
That's our show. That's our show. Take care, everybody.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.